Hi, this is Sejer Ebersole again. In this video, we're going to be discussing, well, a lot of things. We're going to be discussing power, we're going to be discussing force, the relationship between them, and we're also going to be talking about speed, and we're going to talk about resistance, and why all these things are important for us as chiropractors. And it's kind of all for me born from when I learned BGI. There were two sentences that really resonated with me. Into ease, please, and match the tone. Now, the problem with those two sentences, even though they resonate a lot with me, was I didn't understand them. I didn't understand the implications of them either, or even why that was relevant. So let's start breaking this down a little bit from the top. So power versus force. Let's start there. Years ago, I read a book by a man called Dr. David Hawkins. Not Stephen Hawking. There's no relation between the two. Dr. David Hawkins was a psychologist and I suppose a philosopher, and he had gone on a journey and became enlightened. And when he came back, he started teaching a lot of different things. One of the things that he was teaching about was the non-duality of nature of things in nature. So non-duality or non-dualistic basically means that, for example, if we have hot and we have cold, we think of those things as being it's either hot or it's cold. Well, that's a dualistic way of thinking about temperature. Now, non-dualistic way of thinking about temperature is that hot and cold are on a scale, and in one end there's cold and in one end there's hot. And actually, the absence of heat is what is cold. And so there's a scalar relationship between heat and cold, all depending on how much energy it contains. And if we look at power and force, we tend to think, well, oh, that's a powerful person or that's a forceful person. And when we experience life, we will see that people who are that will either be forceful or powerful, and that those two things kind of negate each other. And this is actually not so. Power and force are on a scale just like temperature is. And so on one end of the scale, you have power, and the other end of the scale, you have force, which basically means that the more force you apply, the less power you're going to have. There's still going to be some, but if you use a lot of power, there's going to be just a lot of force, there's going to be just a little bit of power. If you use very little force, there's going to be a lot more power. And this becomes relevant when we start talking about into ease, please, and in our adjustments. Because as we are adjusting, we are delivering a certain amount of force. And so the question becomes, or at least became for me after reading this book, was really, I want to be a powerful person. I don't necessarily want to be a forceful person. I really want to try to have people come in and be empowered. I want to be empowering rather than forcing. And so in my adjustment, that basically means that if I can get away with using very little force, I have at least the potential of delivering a very powerful adjustment. And so when I think about force, the first thing I started thinking of was Newton's second law. Newton's second law states that force is equals m times a. M is mass, a is acceleration, which basically means if you have an object that has a large mass and a large amount of acceleration, it's going to have a lot of force, and that there's a relationship between those two things. And so when I start thinking about how I apply my skills as a chiropractor in my adjustment, especially my osseous adjustments, I do have a certain amount of mass, and I can perform a certain amount of acceleration or speed. In the beginning of my career, when I sucked at adjusting and hadn't built the speed, I could still be successful and have good results. And I think a lot of that had to do with me being a strong person. I could apply a lot of mass or pressure to my adjustments, and that would help along the transferal of force or energy into the person's system, whereby a change would be caused. So I've been trying to apply and change my skill set to be much faster so I don't have to use as much mass. Because what you may also have noticed is that as you apply mass and pressure, what will happen is actually that you're going to be generating more resistance. And basically, if you take someone and you push them, what will usually happen is that they're going to push back. If you take someone and you pull them, usually what's going to happen is that they're going to pull back. So it's completely natural for the human experience that if someone applies force to you, you're going to resist it however you can. So how does all that work? Well, basically, if I use less force, I'm going to meet less resistance, whereby my adjustment can be more powerful and create bigger changes and shifts. And that's very attractive to me, but I wasn't quite satisfied because how does that really work? So thankfully, we have another physicist who came up with this thing called Ohm's law. And now Ohm's law is basically used to see if we have a wire and we pour in a certain amount of voltage on one side, how much current is going to come out on the other side of the wire. So a cool example of this is that if you have a tube instead of a wire, and you fill this tube with marbles, then if you take another marble and you push it in from this side of the tube, then there's going to be a marble that falls out on the other side. And that's basically what current is. So as you start pushing marbles in and from one side, marbles come out on the other side, and that's current. So if I take that tube then and I squeeze it to increase the resistance, then I'm going to require a lot more pressure, a lot more voltage, a lot more force from this side in order to have the same result come out of the other side. Likewise, if I widen the tube up and decrease the resistance, then it's not going to take very much for me. It'll be more effortless to push those marbles through the system. And that's basically how the relationship works between force exerted, or voltage or pressure, resistance, and current. And the interesting thing with current is that it's not just applies to marbles and electricity, it also works for water. It also works for flow. So think of this not so much as current, think of it more as flow, including flow of energy from one system to another. So if we rewrite Ohm's law just a little bit, what we can say is that the amount of power and force that we apply from one side, however much comes out the other side, will depend on how much resistance there is in the system. So if I'm applying a lot of force and trying to force this thing to happen, and I'm generating a lot of resistance on the other side, I have to apply even more force in order for any current or any flow or any effect to come out the other side. Which assumes that the system will even allow for that magnitude of force to pass through it without being compromised. And even if you were to deliver that much force, there's not going to be a lot of power left in it. And so where ease please becomes really, really relevant is that if there's very little resistance, I don't need to do very much. And there's going to be a lot of power transfer. So power versus force. If I use a lot of force, I'm not going to have very much power. If I use a lot of mass or pressure, instead of acceleration, I will still generate a lot of force, but I'm also going to increase the resistance. And if I have very little resistance, the force that I generate will much more easily flow through and have an effect on the other side. So how much pressure to apply or how much force to apply? Well, as little as possible, because the less you do, and this is where, again, one of these sentences that bugged me a lot back in the day was I heard chiropractors saying less is more. And I was like, what are they talking about? More is more. No, but if you have less force, you'll have more power and your adjustments will shift. So the only part that I can't really fit into the whole physics thing is really the matching of the tone. I haven't found that I've been able to find anything in terms of geekiness that can really help me along with that. It really just comes down to experiencing it. How much what is the quality of the tone? How much resistance is there? Even when you put people into as much ease as you can, is there still a certain level of resistance there that has to be met? Again, you want to be able to have some sort of energy transfer, so you are going to be applying a certain amount of force. Even though you want it to be as little as possible, you have to deliver what is necessary in order to have an effect on the other side. So the matching of the tone is, for me, the way I wrap my head around it is the tone is their innate expressing to me what it is that is required, what is it's my access into getting a grip on and feeling what the subluxation tract is all about and what is required in order to help it release and integrate. And that includes how much force do I need to apply. And again, I prefer as little as possible, but at the end of the day, what is needed and what is required is required. So this is how I kind of wrap my head around the whole match the tone, into ease please, and how I've made it make sense to me in a way that my mind can wrap itself around of and understand, so that I can let go the question and be more present in my adjustments.